shows, the France 24 debate has turned its attention to the fight against jihadists in Mali and Algeria, and how the Arab Spring has soured in places like Tunisia and Egypt. The question some are asking is, could Libya be next? Ahead of Friday's second anniversary of the ouster of Muammar Gaddafi, none of the local militias have disarmed. There are political assassinations, the Constituent Assembly is deadlocked, and now the government is shutting its land borders, anticipating violent protests Friday against political gridlock. High-powered UK and US delegations in Paris this Tuesday, part of a conference to help Libya with nation building and with securing both its land and sea borders. Recently, the world took notice of the world's bloodiest ever attack on an oil and gas complex when jihadists stormed the BP Statoil production site 20 kilometers over the border in southern Algeria. So, 18 months after the leaders of France and Britain were feted in Benghazi for leading the outside intervention to oust Libya's strongman of 42 years, Russia's foreign minister is calling it payback. And today in the France 24 debate, we're taking a look at what some are calling Gaddafi's ghost. With us, joining us a little bit later on from Oxford, the former ambassador to Libya from the UK, Oliver Miles. With us here in the studio, the former director of the U.S. State Department's Maghreb office, William Jordan. Welcome back, sir. Welcome as well, a researcher at London Think House, Chatham House, journalist Paul Melly. Welcome to you. And from New Haven, Connecticut, visiting scholar at Yale University, Radidja NEMAR. Welcome to the show, the France 24 debate, where you can always join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. Before we look at the situation more specifically in Tripoli, just to read to you the words of the UK Foreign Secretary William Hague in Paris at that conference this Tuesday, saying it's important, of course, that Libya is able to secure its borders, that it's able to make sure there aren't ungoverned spaces, particularly, he says, in the south of Libya. Militias can be demobilized. That militias can be demobilized, he says. However, when you look at the map of Libya, you see that 2 years on, the militias in each of those big towns have yet to disarm, not to mention, of course, the south. And most cities seem like a fiefdom unto itself. Reporting from Tripoli for The Scotsman, Chris Stephen writes the following: political squabbling and militia violence has left the country on the brink of anarchy. The big militia forces have refused to fall under government control, and bushfire conflicts rage between rival clans in half a dozen towns west and south of the capital. William Jordan, when the French intervened in Mali on this very set, there was one journalist who said, this is the direct result of Libya. And when you look at the situation today in Libya, do you get a sense that ousting Gaddafi was really the easy part and that nobody thought through what would happen afterwards?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think that's been a lot of what you can say is the leitmotif of the Arab Spring uprisings, is that it's been relatively easy compared to the overall process of transformation to get rid of the leaders.
Syria, of course, being an exception.
Well, and the thing is, once he is eventually gone, it will be very hard after Assad is gone in Syria to reconstruct Syria for the same reasons that it's proving difficult in Libya and in so many other places. Absolutely. I mean, there was very little that was gluing or holding Libya together during the regime of Gaddafi. And remember, this was a regime that was very much his own creation. I mean, this was a state that was not actually a state. He had purposely abolished all of the trappings of a state to create sort of this jamahiriya. And so it existed primarily in support of him and what he believed Libya should be doing. So consequently, when he left, there was very little underpinning it, including even the army. I mean, there was not even really much of an army. There were the weapons and there were trained personnel, but there was really no cohesive force to sort of hold everything together in the end.
Reggie Mar, I know that what you look at specifically is nation building in post-conflict areas. What do you do? How do you get the militias in these different cities to hand in their weapons?
Well, first, thanks for having me. And as you were previously saying, actually, once you launch a war, the main issue would be the post-war. What are you going to do after delivering weapon, after winning the war? Because in the case of Libya, well, the Gaddafi part, I must say, would be the most easier one compared to what is after the intervention. So it's not only about demobilization of previous militias, but also about disarmament. And one of the main problems is that I would say that the post-intervention Libya, and mainly the demobilization, disarmament part, had been, I would say, a little bit underestimated. And the way this arms spread over the neighboring countries should have been more taken into account at the very beginning. I don't say that
right, but the question is, what do you do now then?
Well, there is two ways. First, I would say there is two ways depending on the market we're talking about. If we're talking about the formal market on arms trades, there are already international instruments in terms of arms trade regulation and strict arms control, which has to be implemented by the states and through an interstate judicial cooperation in terms of legal cooperation, law enforcement cooperation, but also military cooperation. And these instruments are actually already existing. But the main problem here is on the other side, on the informal market. We have to say that the main issue is after the Libyan war. Most of the people get rid of their arms and weapons, because it was also a way to provide money in an after-war situation where people were in need of money. For example, an AK-47 would cost $800, and for a simple militia, then it could be a lot. Then
a lot of people sold the weapons.
A lot of people sold the weapons, and when you look into the informal market on in the neighboring country around Libya, there has been a real impact after the intervention on Libya and after the death of Gaddafi.
His arsenal being sold off. We're pleased now to be joined by the former UK ambassador to Libya, Oliver Miles, who joins us from Oxford. Ambassador Miles, right now, as we said earlier, there's at least half a dozen cities, not to mention the south of Libya, where there's all these militias are still have their weapons. What do you do? How do you get them to hand in those weapons?
It's a big problem, and the situation arises directly from the revolution. These were young men who simply took arms to fight against Gaddafi, and they were not organized centrally. And when the fighting was over, they remain in existence as militias. They remain in possession of some weapons. We don't know. I don't think anyone really knows how much of Gaddafi's enormous arsenal has been recovered, has been put into use, so to speak. No doubt, a huge amount of it is wasted. It's been destroyed by desert conditions and so on. But the militias are still there. They're not in revolt against the government, but nor are they under the control of the government. And gradually, the government has been working to bring them under control and to persuade the young men that there's an opportunity for them in the new Libyan state. A lot of them are joining the police force. They're beginning to train an army and so on. But there's no way that they can simply exert authority over these armed groups. It has to be done organically, if you like, over a period.
All right, so it has to be done over time, but the problems, of course, are immediate if you're looking at neighboring Mali, for instance, Paul Melly.
Well, one of the problems that happened after the collapse of Gaddafi was that there were quite a large number of Tuareg who had been recruited into Gaddafi's forces. Some had been in Libya for a very long time and had not completely lost touch, but largely lost touch with the Sahelian West African countries from which they originally came. And then a second lot were appear to have been recruited by the Gaddafi regime as it came under pressure during the sort of final crisis. And after the regime was defeated, those forces dispersed, and not all sub-Saharan countries were able to manage the return of these heavily armed fighters very well, whereas Niger did manage to maintain a sort of control process by which returning Tuareg were disarmed and brought back under, as it were, civil order. In Mali, the government in Bamako was already too weak. The Malian state was, as we've been able to see,
as we saw last March when there was a coup in Bamako, and that was enough to tip the scales.
Yes, but even earlier than that, in late 2011, the then elected democratic president Amadou Toumani Touré tried to persuade the returning Tuareg fighters to disarm, and they were not prepared to do so. And he wasn't actually in a position to enforce their disarmament. And those weapons and some of those fighters then fed into the armed movements we saw involved in the internal Malian conflict.
Now, at the top of the show, we showed you images of David Cameron and Nicolas Sarkozy back in September 2011 celebrating the ouster of Gaddafi in Benghazi. Cameron returned to Libya 2 weeks ago as part of a trip that also took him to Algeria in the wake of that attack on the BP gas complex in Amenas, where dozens of expatriates were killed. That site, jointly run by the Algerian and Norwegian company Statoil. It's 20 kilometers from the Libyan border. And you get the impression, again, I got to ask this question to you, Oliver Miles. David Cameron, he'd never been on a trip to Algeria, or no UK Prime Minister had ever been to Algeria before. He suddenly pops up in Algiers and then goes over to Libya. The attack on that gas installation, how much has it changed the perception of what's going on in all of North Africa and the Sahel?
Well, I think it certainly changed David Cameron's perception. I think you're quite right. This was a turning point for him. The stories about the raid on the gas installation in Algeria made big headlines in Britain, which is unusual because Algeria is usually ignored in Britain. Like the rest of Francophone Africa, nobody pays very much attention to it in the media here. So I think he woke up to the fact that there was a real problem which could affect us. I think some of the language he used right at the beginning was rather exaggerated. He talked about an existential threat of which we would have to face for decades and so on. I'm afraid my feeling was rather that this is a permanent problem, that there is lawlessness in the Sahara. There always has been. There are brigands, there are kidnappings. Many of them are for money. Probably the attack on the gas installation in Algeria was of that type. It was planned to take large numbers of hostages and then to sell them, to ransom them. It was unsuccessful. They didn't take any hostages and they lost a lot of men. So I don't think that on maturer consideration one should see this as an enormous setback. It was obviously a very, very unpleasant affair and very damaging and with the loss of life, which is truly regrettable. But it doesn't, I think, open a new chapter in Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb or something like that.
William Jordan, do you agree?
For the most part, I would probably say that it is a big deal in as much as, and certainly viewed somebody who served in Algiers fairly recently. I mean, from the Algerian point of view, it's a big deal. I mean, it's a big embarrassment for them to have suffered this kind of an attack so long after they believed they had basically turned the page from having, from the internal Islamist insurgency, being able to mount that kind of terrorist spectacular. It was a real blow, and I think the United States, I mean, this is one of the reasons why Hillary Clinton, in one of her final appearances on Capitol Hill, made the point that the U.S. government needs, at long last, to pay attention to North Africa as well as Western Africa in the coming years. I mean, I think we do see it, perhaps not in the dramatic terms that David Cameron made or used, but we do see this as something of a turning point. Even though we don't have a lot of prospect for being able to leverage that into anything concrete in the immediate future.
All right. It's not just, by the way, southern Algeria that's feeling the flow of weapons, as Paul MELLY was saying a moment ago. The jihadist takeover of northern Mali last March and last month's French intervention to flush them out. Libyan weapons and fighters who'd been there on the act. When he spoke, though, earlier to France 24's Taoufik Mjahed, Libya's prime minister denied that the Salafist rebels of Mujao were using his country as a rear base.
We have a good relationship with the Americans, but there are no drones over Libya. I haven't heard of any.
All right, we'll hear from that. That was Ali Zaidan talking about drone use. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. He effectively said regarding the Mujao that he staunchly denied when he spoke to us that the Mujao was using his country as a rear base. Your thoughts on that?
Well, from what one can see, Mujao is a movement that brings together a collection of people from a very sort of wide range of origins, whereas Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and the commanders associated with that, like Abu Zaid, is seen as essentially an offshoot of the Algerian radical militant Islamist movement, and Ansar Din is essentially a Malian Tuareg jihadist movement. Mujao was a much more hodgepodge, mixed-up group. In its leadership, you had Mauritanian, Malian, and other figures from a range of places. It seems to be, sometimes it sort of presented itself as the sort of sub-Saharan version of jihadism, and it seems to have drawn people from a very wide range of recruits. It attracted some people from Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, and it seems also to have been the group that may have had attracted some recruits even from further afield, from Asia, from the Middle East, and so on. But
is all this possible thanks to the fact that Libya is effectively this weakest link in North Africa?
No, I think you can see that the Libyan collapse clearly fed into the original takeoff of the Malian crisis because of all the people who returned from Libya and all the weaponry that flowed into the Sahara. But I don't think at this stage there's been much suggestion that the Libyans are, as it were, really providing much of a backstop refuge for Mujao today. The reports one has from Gao and eastern Mali and the upsurge in fighting there in recent days suggest that the fighters who've staged those attacks have tended to be people hiding out locally in the environs. You know, as the French and the troops, the Chad and Nigerian troops came into Gao, some fighters fled north, but others dissipated, hoping to hide out in local communities. And that appears to be the backstop, if you like, of the current activity. I think longer term, the absence of a strong state in Libya poses a whole lot of questions for sub-Saharan Africa, and not just to do with weapons and violence, economic engagement, the political ambitions that Gaddafi had in the Sahara, and migrant labor, which could have a socially destabilizing effect.
When you heard Ambassador Miles there describe it as a long-term process, what does that mean? Does that mean that we could be in for a long period of instability in those sub-Saharan countries?
Well, I don't have any knowledge of the internal situation of Libya, but the overspill effects of the collapse of the Gaddafi model are quite serious. You can go to places in sub-Saharan Africa that are very, very distant from Libya, but where the Libyans maintained a presence. Even in Burundi, for example, they put money into certain sectors, particularly agriculture and tourism and migrant labor, huge numbers of sub-Saharan Africans.
I'm going to cut you off because we have to take a quick break, but we'll pick up on that point. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.